The old pickup truck coughed and wheezed as Jake Martinez pulled into the dusty parking lot of Murphy's Tavern. Black smoke puffed from the exhaust pipe, and he knew this tired old vehicle was hanging on by a thread, just like everything else in his life. He turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at the neon beer sign flickering in the window. The red light cast strange shadows across his weathered face, highlighting the worry lines that had grown deeper over the past few months. Jake's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. These same hands had once been his pride, strong, capable. Hands that could rope a steer, fix a broken fence, or gentle a scared horse. Now they felt empty, useless. The calluses were still there, evidence of 20 years working on ranches across Texas, but they served as painful reminders of what he'd lost rather than symbols of what he could do. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, his last paycheck stub from the Double R Ranch. 3 months ago seemed like a lifetime. The numbers on that stub represented the end of his steady income, his health insurance, and his sense of purpose. What old man Richardson had called all the hands together that gray morning in April, Jake had known what was coming. The drought had been merciless, turning green pastures into cracked earth and forcing cattle sales that nobody wanted to make. "Boys, I hate to do this," Richardson had said, his voice cracking with emotion. "This ranch has been in my family for 4 generations. But I can't keep you all on. The bank's breathing down my neck, and the cattle prices ... He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would change so many lives. Jake had been one of the last hired, so he was among the first to go. No hard feelings, Richardson had assured him. Just bad luck and worse timing. The handshake they'd shared felt final, like closing a book he wasn't ready to stop reading. Now, 3 months later, Jake was down to his last $43.17. He'd counted it twice that morning, spreading the crumpled bills and loose change across the small table in his rented room above the hardware store. The rent was due in 4 days, and Mrs. Chun, his landlord, had already been patient enough. She'd knocked on his door yesterday, her kind eyes filled with sympathy as she'd asked about the money he owed. "I know times are hard, Jake," she'd said, in her gentle voice. "But my own bills, they don't wait either." He'd promised her the rent by Friday, though he had no idea how he'd come up with it. The job applications he'd filled out over the past weeks had yielded nothing but polite rejections and uncomfortable silences. The ranching industry was struggling everywhere, and there were too many experienced hands competing for too few positions. Jake pushed open the heavy door of Murphy's Tavern and stepped inside. The familiar smell of beer, fried food, and cigarette smoke wrapped around him like an unwelcome blanket. The place hadn't changed much in the 15 years he'd been coming here. Same scarred wooden tables, same dusty bottles lined up behind. The bar, same old jukebox in the corner playing country songs that seemed to understand heartbreak better than people did. Murphy himself stood behind the bar, a thick-set man with graying hair and forearms like tree trunks. He'd owned this place since before Jake had ever set foot in town, and he'd seen plenty of down-on-their-luck cowboys come and go. His eyes met Jake's across the room, and there was understanding there, but no pity. Jake appreciated that more than Murphy would ever know. "Usual?" Murphy asked as Jake approached the bar. "Just a beer," Jake replied, sliding a $5 bill across the polished wood. "Whatever's cheapest." Murphy poured a draft beer without comment and slid it across. Jake noticed he didn't ask for the full price, probably only charged him $3 instead of the usual $5. Small kindnesses like this had been keeping him afloat, and he wasn't too proud to accept them anymore. Jake carried his beer to a corner table, where he could see the whole room but stay mostly out of sight. He'd learned to avoid the center tables where the regular customers sat. Not because they were mean to him exactly, but because their conversations about work and weekend plans served as constant reminders of what he'd lost. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a folded newspaper. Yesterday's edition that someone had left behind at the diner where he'd had coffee that morning. The classified section was already circled and marked up from his earlier search, but he scanned it again anyway, hoping he'd missed something the first time through. Ranch hand needed, experienced only. He'd already called that one. Wanted someone who could bring their own horse and equipment. Construction crew hiring. His back wasn't what it used to be, and he'd never worked construction, but maybe they'd give him a chance. Delivery driver wanted. His truck might not make it through a week of deliveries, but desperate times called for desperate measures. At the table next to his, 3 men in work boots and high-visibility vests were laughing about something that had happened at their construction site. Their clothes were dirty from an honest day's work, and they had that comfortable tiredness that comes from steady employment. Jake remembered that feeling, the satisfaction of a job well done and a paycheck coming at the end of the week. One of them was telling a story about a new guy who'd showed up that morning claiming to have experience he obviously didn't have. Tried to use a hammer like it was a feather duster, the man laughed. Boss sent him packing before lunch break. The others joined in the laughter, and Jake found himself smiling despite his troubles. Working men were the same everywhere. They took care of their own and had little patience for pretenders, but they'd give an honest man a fair chance. As the evening wore on, Jake nursed his single beer and continued his job search. The newspaper was starting to fall apart from all his folding and refolding, but he wasn't ready to give up. Tomorrow he'd start making calls, visiting job sites, doing whatever it took to find work. His pride had taken enough hits that he was willing to start at the bottom if necessary. The tavern was filling up with the usual crowd, workers unwinding after their shifts, locals catching up on gossip, and a few drifters like himself trying to make their money last. It wasn't the worst place to spend an evening when you had nowhere else to go, and Murphy didn't pressure customers to keep ordering as long as they weren't causing trouble. Jake looked around at the familiar faces and realized that this place had become a kind of second home to him over the years. When times were good, he'd celebrated here. When times were tough, like now, it offered shelter from a world that seemed to have no place for him. Maybe that was enough for tonight, just being somewhere warm and safe while he figured out his next move. Little did Jake know that his next move was about to walk through that door, and it would change everything. The old brass bell above Murphy's tavern door let out its familiar jingle, but this time it seemed different somehow. Jake looked up from his newspaper to see 2 small figures silhouetted against the evening light streaming through the doorway. At first glance, they looked like shadows, thin and fragile against the warm glow from the street lamps outside. As his eyes adjusted, Jake realized they were young girls, maybe 12 or 13 years old. They stood close together, almost like they were trying to take up as little space as possible. Both had long dark hair pulled back into simple ponytails, and their clothes, while clean, had seen better days. The taller girl wore a faded blue dress that was slightly too big for her, while her sister had on jeans with patches on the knees and a sweater that had been mended more than once. What caught Jake's attention most, though, was what they carried. Between them, a guitar case, old and battered, with stickers from places he'd never heard of covering its worn surface. The case looked almost as big as they were, and they struggled to carry it together, their small hands gripping the handle. With determination, the tavern had grown busier since Jake first arrived. The after-work crowd had settled in, construction workers still wearing their hard hats, office workers with loosened ties, and a few ranch hands from the spreads that were still operating. The air was thick with conversation and the clinking of glasses, but something about the girl's entrance seemed to quiet the room just a bit. Murphy looked up from behind the bar, his thick eyebrows raising in surprise. In all his years running this place, he'd seen plenty of unusual customers walk through that door, but 2 young girls carrying a guitar case was definitely a first. He set down the glass he'd been cleaning and watched as they approached the bar with careful, measured steps. The shorter girl, who Jake would later learn was Sophia, seemed to be the braver of the 2. She stepped forward slightly, her chin raised despite the obvious nervousness in her dark eyes. Her sister Maria stayed close behind, one hand resting protectively on the guitar case. "Excuse me, sir," Sophia said, her voice barely loud enough to carry over the tavern noise. She had a slight accent that suggested Spanish was probably her first language, but her English was clear and careful. Could we maybe sing a song for your customers, just 1 or 2 songs?" Murphy frowned. not in anger but in confusion. "Girls, where are your parents? You shouldn't be in here alone?" Maria finally spoke up, her voice even quieter than her sister's. "Our mama, she's at home. She paused, glancing at Sophia for support. "She's real sick and we need money." "For her medicine?" The honesty in her voice was like a punch to the gut. Jake found himself leaning forward, straining to hear over the background noise of the tavern. Several other customers had noticed the conversation too, and their own talks were dying down as they turned to listen. Sophia nodded eagerly, encouraged by her sister's words. "We're good singers, honest. We practice every day and people always say we sound nice together. We won't bother nobody, we promise. We'll just stand in the corner and sing real quiet like." Murphy's expression softened. He was a tough man who dealt with every kind of troublemaker and sob story over the years, but there was something about these two girls that got to him. Maybe it was the way they stood so close together, like they were each other's only protection in a big, scary world. Or maybe it was the genuine desperation in their voices when they mentioned their sick mother. "Your mama know you're here?" he asked, though his tone was gentler now. "She thinks we're at the library," Maria admitted, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "But the library closes at 6, and we tried singing at the bus station, but the security guard told us to move along. And we tried at the grocery store, but they said we needed a permit or something." Jake's heart clenched. These girls had been walking around town all evening, trying to find a place where someone would let them earn a few dollars for their mothers. Medicine. He thought about his own struggles, his own pride, and realized these kids were showing more courage than he'd managed in months. The construction workers at the nearby table had been listening too, and one of them, a big man with paint-stained coveralls, called out, "Let him try, Murphy. What's the harm?" His buddy laughed, but it wasn't a kind sound. "Yeah, this should be entertaining. Haven't had live music in here since that drunk guy tried to sing karaoke last Christmas." Sophia's face lit up with hope while Maria clutched the guitar case handle tighter. They could sense the opportunity, fragile as it was, and they weren't about to let it slip away. Murphy looked around his tavern, taking in the faces of his regular customers. Some looked curious, others seemed annoyed by the interruption, and a few appeared genuinely interested in hearing what these girls could do. Business had been slow lately, and maybe a little entertainment wouldn't hurt. "All right," he said finally, holding up one thick finger. "One song. You stand right there by the wall, out of the way of my waitress, and if anybody complains, you pack up and go home to your mama, understood?" The girls nodded so fast Jake thought they might hurt their necks. "Thank you, mister," Sophia said, her voice bright with gratitude. "Thank you so much." They hurried over to the spot Murphy had indicated, a small area near the wall where the lighting was dim but adequate. Maria carefully set the guitar case down and opened the latches with practiced movements. Inside, nestled in faded red velvet, was an acoustic guitar that had clearly seen years of use, but had been lovingly maintained. As Maria lifted the guitar out, Jake could see her hands shake slightly. Whether from nerves or excitement, he couldn't tell, but there was something about the careful way she handled the instrument that suggested real skill and respect for the music. Sophia pulled a small folded piece of paper from her pocket, probably lyrics, though Jake suspected they had their songs memorized. The girls whispered to each other in rapid Spanish, their heads close together as they made their final preparations. The tavern had grown noticeably quieter now. Even the customers who had seemed annoyed by the interruption found themselves curious about what these two young girls could possibly perform that would be worth stopping their conversations for. Murphy called out to his waitress. Betty, a woman in her 50s who'd been working at the tavern almost as long as Murphy had owned it. "Keep an eye on things, Betty. Let's see what these girls can do." Betty nodded and continued her rounds, but Jake noticed she moved a bit more quietly, like she didn't want to disturb whatever was about to happen. Maria strummed a few quiet chords, testing the guitar's tune. The sound was clean and clear, professional even. Sophia hummed along softly, finding her pitch. Despite their obvious nervousness, there was something confident about the way they prepared, like they'd done this many times before, just not in a place like this. The moment was building, tension filling the air like electricity before a storm. Jake found himself holding his breath, waiting to see if these brave young girls could back up their promises with actual talent. Around the room, other customers were beginning to pay attention too, conversations trailing off as anticipation grew. Whatever happened next, Jake realized nothing would be quite the same after these girls opened their mouths to sing. Maria's fingers moved carefully across the guitar strings, making small adjustments to the tuning pegs. Each note she plucked echoed softly in the increasingly quiet tavern, but Jake could see her hands trembling slightly. Sophia stood beside her sister, smoothing down her faded sweater and taking deep breaths like their mama had probably taught them to do before performing. The silence in Murphy's Tavern felt heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. About 30 people were scattered across the room, and most of them had turned to watch the two girls preparing in their dim corner. Some faces showed genuine curiosity, others mild annoyance at having their conversations interrupted. But Jake noticed a few expressions that made his stomach tighten with worry. At a round table near the center of the room, 4 construction workers sat with their after-work beers. They'd been loud and rowdy all evening, celebrating the end of another tough week on a job site downtown. The biggest one, a man with a thick neck and arms covered in tattoos, had been telling crude jokes that made Jake wince. His name tag read Foreman, and he clearly enjoyed being the center of attention. Among his crew, well, the foreman said, loud enough for half the tavern to hear. Looks like we got ourselves some entertainment tonight, boys. He took a long swig of his beer and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Hope they're better then. That's our excuse for a band they had at the county fair last month. His buddies chuckled, but there was an edge to their laughter that didn't sit right with Jake. He'd worked alongside men like this before, good workers. Most of them, but sometimes they got mean when they'd been drinking and had an audience to perform for. Maria finished tuning the guitar and looked up at Sophia with a small, nervous smile. They whispered something to each other in Spanish, probably words of encouragement or maybe a quick prayer. Jake found himself silently rooting for them, hoping they'd prove these roughnecks wrong. "You girls better make this good," called out another voice from across the room. A man in a business suit sat alone at the bar, his tie loosened and his face flushed from whatever he'd been drinking. "Some of us got important places to be tonight." Sophia's cheeks turned red, but she lifted her chin with determination. "We'll do our best, sir," she said politely, her voice barely carrying across the room. "Do your best?" The foreman laughed loudly. "Honey, this ain't a school talent show. These folks paid good money for their drinks, and now they gotta listen. Do you kids practice your little songs?" Jake's jaw tightened. The girls hadn't asked anyone to listen, they'd simply asked Murphy for permission to perform. But he could see how the foreman's words affected them. Maria's shoulders hunched forward slightly, and Sophia's confident expression wavered. "Maybe they should stick to singing in the church choir," suggested one of the foreman's crew, a thin man with a scraggly beard. "That's where kids belong, not in a place like this bothering working folks." "Assuming they even go to church," added another, causing more laughter from their table. Betty, the waitress, shot a disapproving look toward the construction workers as she cleared empty glasses from a nearby table. Jake could tell she didn't like what she was hearing, but she was just trying to do her job and probably didn't want to start trouble with customers. Murphy was busy with something behind the bar, either not hearing the comments or choosing to ignore them. Jake suspected it was the latter. Murphy had been running this place long enough to know that sometimes it was better to let things play out rather than escalate a situation. The girls began whispering to each other again, and Jake could see Sophia's eyes starting to shine with unshed tears. Maria put a protective arm around her sister's shoulders, and they huddled closer together like they were trying to make themselves invisible. "Look at them," the businessman at the bar said, turning on his stool to face the room. "Already crying. And they haven't even started yet. Maybe this was a bad idea, girls. Why don't you just pack up that guitar and head on home to Mama?" The cruelty in his voice made Jake's hands clench into fists. He'd seen enough bullying in his life and school. Yards, on job sites, and bars like this one. It always started the same way, with someone deciding they were better than someone else and needing to prove it in front of an audience. Yeah, the foreman agreed, warming to the topic. Little girls got no business in a grown-up place like this anyway. What's your mama thinking, letting you wander around at night? She ought to know better. Sophia's chin quivered, but Maria squeezed her sister's hand and whispered something that seemed to give her strength. They straightened up together, and Maria positioned the guitar more securely in her arms. "We're ready?" Sophia announced, though her voice was much quieter than before. "Ready for what?" laughed the scraggly bearded man. "To embarrass yourselves? To waste everyone's time with some nursery rhymes?" A few other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jake could see that not everyone in the tavern was enjoying this display of meanness, but nobody was speaking up either. That was how it usually went. Good people stayed quiet while bullies took control of the room. "I bet they don't even know any real songs," the foreman continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Probably just gonna sing Happy Birthday or something they learned in school." His crew laughed on cue, like they'd done this dance before with other targets in other places. Jake recognized the pattern, pack mentality, feeding off each other's cruelty until it spiraled out of control. Maria started to play a soft chord progression, but her fingers fumbled slightly, producing a sour note that rang out in the quiet room. The mistake was small, barely noticeable, but it was all the ammunition the bullies needed. "Oh, that's just beautiful," the businessman said sarcastically. "Real professional there, sweetheart." "Maybe they need more practice," suggested the foreman with mock concern. "Like about 10 more years of practice." Sophia's face crumpled, and Jake could see she was fighting hard not to cry. Maria's hands were shaking so badly now that she could barely hold the guitar steady. The song they'd planned to sing, whatever it was, seemed to be slipping away from them with each cruel comment. "This is painful to watch," said another customer, a middle-aged woman at a corner table. But instead of defending the girls, she sounded annoyed, like their struggle was inconveniencing her evening. Jake looked around the room and felt sick to his stomach. These two brave little girls had walked into this place hoping to earn a few dollars for their mother's medicine, and instead they were being torn down by adults who should have known better. The girls were trying so hard to be strong, but Jake could see they were moments away from giving up entirely. The foreman wasn't done yet. "Maybe we should take up a collection," he announced to the room. "Not for their singing, for acting lessons. They're gonna need if they plan to keep pretending they know what they're doing." That got the biggest laugh yet from this table, and even a few chuckles from customers who'd been quiet up until now. Jake watched Sophia's shoulders shake with the effort of holding back tears, while Maria clutched the guitar like it was the only thing keeping her anchored. The moment hung in the air like a blade ready to fall. The girls looked ready to pack up their guitar and flee from the tavern, their dreams of helping their sick mother crushed by the casual cruelty of strangers. Jake could feel his heart pounding as he watched them prepare to surrender. Something had to change, and it had to change right now. Jake's hands gripped his beer bottle so tight his knuckles had turned white. He sat frozen in his corner table, watching Sophia's shoulders shake as she fought back tears, while her sister Maria struggled to keep the guitar steady in her trembling hands. The laughter from the construction workers cut through the air like broken glass, and every cruel word felt like a punch to Jake's gut. He'd been in their shoes before. Different circumstances, maybe, but he knew what it felt like to have your dignity stripped away piece by piece while people watched and did nothing. Just 3 months ago, he'd stood in Richardson's office, hat in hand, listening to explanations about drought and bank payments while his whole world crumbled. The other ranch hands had avoided his eyes that day. Just like most of the tavern customers were avoiding the girl's eyes now, the businessman at the bar was still talking, his voice growing louder and more confident as he fed off the laughter around him. "Seriously, girls, you're making everyone uncomfortable. Maybe it's time to admit this wasn't such a good idea." Sophia looked up at her sister with such raw hope and desperation that it nearly broke Jake's heart. These weren't spoiled kids looking for attention or easy money. These were two young girls who'd walked around town all evening, getting turned away from place after place, just trying to help their sick mother. And now they were about to give up because a bunch of grown adults couldn't show them basic human decency. Jake thought about the $20 bill folded in his wallet. It was all he had left until he found work, money he'd been saving for rent or gas or whatever emergency came next. $20 that represented the difference between having options and having none at all. But looking at those girls, he realized some things were more important than his own comfort. The foreman was winding up for another joke, his crew leaning in with anticipation when Jake's chair scraped loudly against the wooden floor. The sound cut through the tavern noise like a thunderclap, and conversations faltered as heads turned to see what was happening. Jake stood slowly, unfolding his full height inch by inch. He wasn't the biggest man in the room, but there was something about the way he moved that commanded attention. Maybe it was the quiet confidence that came from years of hard work. Or maybe it was simply the fact that someone was finally standing up when everyone else had chosen to sit and watch. His weathered boots made soft thudding sounds against the floor as he walked toward the girls. Each step felt heavy with purpose, like he was crossing more than just the 20 feet between his table and theirs. He could feel every eye in the room following his movement, the tension building with each stride. The construction workers' laughter died completely as Jake approached. The foreman's smile faltered, unsure what this stranger intended to do. Betty, the waitress, paused in her rounds, sensing something important was about to happen. Even Murphy looked up from behind the bar, his thick eyebrows raised in curiosity. Jake stopped beside Sophia, close enough that she could feel his presence, but not so close as to frighten her. Up close, he could see she was even younger than he'd first thought, maybe 11 at most. Her dark eyes were bright with unshed tears, but there was still fight in them, still hope that someone might give them a chance. "Ladies," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent tavern. It wasn't loud, but it had the kind of authority that came from years of talking to spooked horses and anxious cattle. "I'd be honored to hear your song." Sophia blinked in surprise, and Maria looked up from her guitar with wonder. They'd been expecting another insult, another reason to pack up and leave. Instead, this weathered stranger was offering them exactly what they'd been hoping for all along. Someone willing to listen. Jake turned slightly, just enough to address the room without taking his attention completely away from the girls. His eyes found the foreman's table, then the businessman at the bar, then swept across the other customers who'd been enjoying the show at these children's expense. "These young ladies," Jake continued, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel underneath, "have more courage than most folks I know. They could have stayed home feeling sorry for themselves, but instead they're out here trying to help their family. That takes guts." The foreman's face had gone from amused to confused to something approaching embarrassment. His crew had stopped, looking at him for cues, their attention focused entirely on this unexpected defender who'd appeared from nowhere. "Now," Jake said, reaching into his back pocket for his wallet, "I don't know about the rest of you, but I came here tonight looking for some good music, and I'm betting these girls can deliver exactly that." His wallet was old and cracked, held together with duct tape in two places. Jake opened it carefully and pulled out his last $20 bill. The paper was wrinkled and soft from being folded and refolded, but it represented everything he had left in the world. Without hesitation, Jake bent down and placed the bill in the girl's open guitar case, right on top of the faded red velvet lining. The money looked small and humble lying there alone, but to Sophia and Maria, it might as well have been a treasure chest. "For your mama's medicine," Jake said gently, his voice softening as he spoke directly to them. "And because everyone deserves to be heard, especially when they're brave enough to try." Sophia's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different tears entirely. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much, mister." Maria nodded vigorously, clutching her guitar tighter but with newfound confidence. The trembling in her hands had stopped, replaced by determination that seemed to radiate from her small frame. Jake straightened up and looked around the room again. The atmosphere had shifted completely. The cruel laughter was gone, replaced by uncomfortable silence from some customers and growing curiosity from others. A few people looked ashamed of themselves, while others seemed genuinely interested in hearing what the girls could do. "I think," Jake announced to the room, "we're about to hear something special. These girls didn't come here to waste anyone's time. They came here because they needed help, and they were willing to work for it. That's more than I can say for some folks." He didn't name names or point fingers, but everyone in the tavern knew exactly who he was talking about. The foreman stared down into his beer, suddenly fascinated by the foam on top. The businessman had turned back to face the bar, his shoulders hunched with what might have been shame. Betty, the waitress, was the first to break the new silence. She walked over to her purse behind the bar, pulled out a $5 bill, and added it to the guitar case without saying a word. Her simple action seemed to give others permission to reconsider their positions. An older man at a corner table reached for his wallet. A young couple near the window whispered to each other, then the woman nodded encouragingly. The room's energy was transforming from mockery to anticipation, from cruelty to curiosity. Jake took a step back to give the girls space, but he remained close enough to show his support. "Whenever you're ready, ladies," he said with a gentle smile. "Take your time and show them what you can do." Sophia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and straightened her shoulders. Maria adjusted her grip on the guitar and looked at her sister with renewed confidence. The fear and uncertainty that had dominated their faces just moments before was melting away, replaced by the quiet determination that had brought them here in the first place. The tavern waited in respectful silence now, a complete reversal from the hostile crowd they'd faced just minutes earlier. All it had taken was one person willing to stand up and remind everyone else what basic human decency looked like. Jake crossed his arms and settled in to listen, hoping these brave girls would prove him right. Maria looked down at the guitar case where Jake's $20 bill lay beside Betty's $5, and something magical happened to her expression. The fear that had clouded her dark eyes just minutes before melted away, replaced by a calm confidence that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. She glanced at her sister Sophia, and they shared one of those silent conversations that only twins can have. Sophia wiped the last trace of tears from her cheeks and stood a little straighter, her chin lifted with newfound pride, and when she looked out at the tavern full of people, she no longer saw a hostile crowd. She saw an audience, people who might actually listen, thanks to the kindness of a stranger who believed in them. When nobody else would, the tavern had grown so quiet that Jake could hear the old air conditioning unit humming in the corner and the distant sound of traffic outside on Main Street. 30-some people sat in respectful silence, some leaning forward with genuine curiosity, others still looking uncomfortable but no longer actively cruel. Even the foreman and his construction crew had stopped their snickering, though whether from shame or interest, Jake couldn't tell. Maria positioned her fingers on the guitar strings and played a soft, testing chord. This time her hands were steady, her touch confident and sure. The sound that came from the old guitar was clean and beautiful, resonating in the wooden-walled tavern like it had been designed for music. Sophia closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and when she opened them again, she was transformed. This wasn't the scared little girl who'd walked into the tavern an hour ago. This was a performer, someone who knew exactly what she was capable of and wasn't afraid to show it. Maria began playing a gentle melody, her fingers moving across the strings with the kind of skill that only came from years of practice. The tune was hauntingly beautiful, something Jake didn't recognize but that felt familiar anyway, like a half-remembered lullaby from childhood. Each note hung in the air perfectly, creating an atmosphere of peace and expectation. Then Sophia began to sing. Her voice started soft and low, almost like a whisper, but it carried clearly to every corner of the tavern. She was singing in Spanish, words that flowed like water over smooth stones. Even the customers who didn't speak the language could understand the emotion behind every syllable. There was love there, and hope, and a deep sadness that spoke of struggle and loss. Jake felt goosebumps rise on his arms. He'd heard plenty of singers over the years, in churches and honky-tonks, on the radio and at county fairs. But this was different. This wasn't just someone singing a song, this was art, pure and simple. Coming from the heart of a child who had lived more hardship than most adults, Maria's voice joined her sister's on the second verse, creating a harmony so perfect it seemed impossible that two people could blend their voices so seamlessly. They weren't just singing together. They were creating something entirely new, something greater than the sum of its parts. The construction worker with the scraggly beard, who'd been making jokes just minutes before, found his mouth hanging open in amazement. His beer sat forgotten on the table as he stared at the two girls, unable to believe what he was hearing. The businessman at the bar had turned completely around on his stool, his earlier hostility replaced by something approaching wonder. His hand had moved unconsciously toward his wallet. Though he didn't seem to realize it yet, Betty had stopped pretending to work and was standing motionless by the bar, a dish towel clutched in her hands and tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. She'd heard a lot of music in her 50-odd years, but nothing had ever moved her quite like this. Murphy himself had come out from behind the bar, and was standing with his thick arms crossed, but his gruff expression had softened completely. As a business owner, he'd been worried about letting the girls perform, concerned they might drive away customers. Now he was worried they might finish too soon. Sophia's voice soared higher, reaching notes that seemed to touch the ceiling and bounce back down to wrap around everyone in the room like a warm blanket. Her sister's harmony followed perfectly, creating layers of sound that filled every empty space in the tavern. Jake found himself thinking about his own mother, who died when he was barely older than these girls. She used to sing while she cooked. Dinner, nothing fancy, just old country songs she'd learned from her own mother. But her voice had that same quality, pure, honest, straight from the heart. The song built to a crescendo that raised goosebumps on every arm in the room, then settled back down to a gentle, almost whispered conclusion. The last note hung in the air for what felt like forever, and when it finally faded, the silence that followed was deeper than anything Jake had ever experienced. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. The entire tavern sat frozen in that perfect moment, afraid that any sound might break the spell these two young girls had cast over them. Then, slowly, someone started clapping. Jake looked around to see who it was and realized with surprise that it was him. His calloused hands came together in steady, measured applause that seemed to wake everyone else from their trance. The businessman at the bar jumped to his feet, clapping so hard his face turned red. Betty was wiping her eyes with her dish towel, but applauding with her elbows. The construction workers were on their feet too, even the foreman who'd been so cruel earlier, pounding their hands together with genuine enthusiasm. The applause built like thunder, filling the tavern with sound that was the complete opposite of the cruel laughter from before. This was appreciation, respect, and something approaching awe for what they'd just witnessed. "More!" called out someone from the back of the room. "Sing another one," but the girls just smiled and shook their heads. They'd said they would sing one song, and they were true to their word. Besides, they seemed to understand instinctively that nothing they could do would top what had just happened. The businessman was already walking toward them, pulling out his wallet as he moved. "That was incredible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry about what I said before. That was wrong of me." He pulled out a $10 bill and placed it carefully in their guitar case. Behind him, other customers were forming a line, each waiting their turn to contribute and offer their apologies. The foreman approached with his crew, his earlier swagger replaced by genuine humility. "Girls," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that was the most beautiful thing I've heard in my whole life. I'm real sorry about how we acted." His crew nodded in agreement, each adding their own bills to the growing collection in the guitar case. What had started as $25 from Jake and Betty had grown to over $100 in just a few minutes. Murphy walked over to Jake, who was still standing near the girls with a smile of satisfaction on his weathered face. "That was something else," Murphy said quietly. "Haven't seen anything like that in 20 years of running this place." He paused, studying Jake's face. "You know, I've been thinking about hiring some help around here." Someone to keep an eye on things, maybe coordinate some entertainment on weekends. You interested in steady work? Jake's heart jumped, but he kept his voice calm. Depends on what it pays. Murphy named a figure that was more than Jake had made at the ranch, plus tips and meals. You showed real character tonight, Murphy explained. That's worth something in my book. As Jake shook Murphy's hand, he looked over at Sophia and Maria, who were carefully counting their earnings with wonder in their eyes. They had enough for their mother's medicine and plenty left over, but more importantly, they'd found their voices again. Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places.